Northern Wisconsin, October 1891. The air carried the first knife-edge promise of winter. The aspens had surrendered their gold, leaving skeletal branches scratching against a steel-gray sky like the fingers of old women reaching toward heaven. In the small settlement of Ridgewood Hollow, tucked into a valley 52 miles from the nearest real town, men were banking earth against their cabin foundations, splitting the last of their seasoned oak, caulking the endless gaps between logs with mud and moss and prayer. The valley held 31 families, most of them farmers and loggers who had come west seeking land and opportunity. They had found both, along with winters that could kill a man who wasn't prepared. The old-timers said that Ridgewood Hollow sat in a natural funnel, a gap in the hills that channeled Arctic air straight down from Canada, like water through a sluice. When the north wind blew, it blew harder here than anywhere else in the county. The settlement had a general store, a church, a small schoolhouse, and a blacksmith shop. It had no doctor closer than the county seat, no telegraph line, no railroad. When winter came, Ridgewood Hollow was on its own. All across the valley, men prepared for the siege. They checked their wood piles, counted their stores of flour and salt pork, reinforced barn doors and chicken coops. They did what their fathers had done, and their grandfathers before them, all except one woman. Astrid Lindgren was digging, not a root cellar, not a well, but long, peculiar trenches radiating from the base of her modest cabin, like the legs of a great earthen spider. One trench snaked 70 feet toward the small cabin of the widow Dorothea Pembry. Another angled 60 feet to the slightly larger home of Nella Whitaker and her 3 young children. A third, the longest at nearly 90 feet, aimed for the lonely bachelor cabin of old Ezekiel Holloway. She was not just digging. She was lining these channels with flat field stones, creating careful rectangular tunnels about 2 feet wide and 2 feet high. The work was slow, backbreaking, and utterly baffling to everyone who passed by. Astrid was 32 years old. Her hair, the color of winter wheat, was pulled back in a practical braid that had come loose hours ago. Her hands, once soft, were now calloused and bleeding in places where the stones had scraped them raw. Dirt streaked her face like war paint. Her apron was torn. Her back screamed with every stone she lifted, but she did not stop. She could not stop, because she had made a promise to a dead man, and she intended to keep it. Her son Leif worked beside her. He was 10 years old, small for his age but fierce in his determination. His thin shoulders strained under loads that would challenge a grown man. His hands were blistered, the blisters broken and bleeding, but he did not complain. He worked with a grim focus that no child should have possessed, his jaw set in an expression that was heartbreakingly similar to his father's. Her daughter Solveig, 7 years old with her father's bright blue eyes, carried water and bandages. She did not complain. She did not cry. She simply worked, one small task at a time, because that was what her mother needed. Sometimes she sang softly as she worked, was Norwegian lullabies that her father had taught her, songs about trolls and fjords and the northern lights. And always, lying in the shade of a nearby oak, watching everything with pale amber eyes, was Odin. The Norwegian elk hound was 4 years old, his coat the color of storm clouds and silver moonlight. He had belonged to Astrid's husband, Gunnar, brought all the way from Norway on the ship that had carried them to America. He was the last living connection to that man she still had. Odin had been born in a small village outside Bergen, one of a litter of 7. Gunnar had chosen him because he was the runt, the smallest and weakest of the puppies, the one that the breeder had been ready to drown. "He has spirit," Gunnar had said, holding the tiny creature in his massive hands. "He just needs someone to believe in him." That had been Gunnar's way. He saw potential where others saw only weakness. He believed in things that sensible people dismissed as impossible. He had believed in Astrid too, when she was just a fisherman's daughter with no education and no prospects. He had seen something in her that no one else had seen, and he had spent 12 years helping her become the woman she was capable of being. Now he was gone, and Odin was all she had left of him. When strangers approached the worksite, the dog would rise to his feet. He never growled. He never bared his teeth. He simply stood, amber eyes fixed and watchful, until the stranger moved on. He understood. in the way that dogs sometimes understand things their masters never explain. He was guarding what remained of his family. 8 months ago, and Astrid Lindgren had been a different woman. 8 months ago, she had been a wife. The memory came to her unbidden as she lifted another stone into place, her muscles screaming, her heart heavier than any rock she could carry. A February night, bitter cold, the wind howling through every crack in their cabin walls like a chorus of hungry wolves. Little Solveig burning with fever, her small body shaking under every blanket they owned. Ice forming on the inside of the windows, beautiful and deadly, while Astrid sang Norwegian lullabies through her own chattering teeth. The fireplace was roaring, consuming logs as fast as Gunnar could feed them. But the heat seemed to vanish as quickly as it was created. Astrid could feel the cold pressing in from every direction, seeping through the walls, rising up from the frozen ground beneath their feet. Solveig was dying. Astrid knew it with the terrible certainty that mothers possess. The fever was too high. The cold was too deep. Their daughter was slipping away, and there was nothing they could do. And Gunnar sat at their small table that night, bent over his leather journal by the light of a guttering candle, drawing. He was always drawing in those days, sketches and calculations filling page after page, diagrams of something he called a masonry heater, tunnels running underground, stone platforms that would radiate warmth like captured summer sun. She had asked him once why he spent so many nights bent over those pages instead of sleeping, instead of holding her, instead of resting his body for the brutal labor of the next day. He had looked up at her with those bright blue eyes that still made her heart skip after 12 years of marriage. His face was gaunt from a winter of short rations. His hands were rough and cracked from the cold, but his eyes burned with a fire that no winter could extinguish. "Because our daughter is shivering," he said, "because this fireplace eats our wood and gives us nothing but smoke and cold drafts in return. Because I spent 20 years in the boiler rooms of Baltic steamships, and I know there is a better way." He had risen from the table and crossed to where she sat with Solveig. He had knelt beside them, his big hands gentle as he stroked his daughter's fevered brow. "In Norway," he said quietly, "my grandfather heated his house with stones. Not a fireplace, something different. Something that held the heat for hours after the fire went out. The floor was always warm, even in the darkest winter. Children played barefoot on boards that felt like summer." He looked at Astrid, and she saw tears in his eyes. "I know how to build it. I've been designing it for months, but this winter came too fast. We weren't ready." He stood and returned to his journal. "But next winter," he said, and his voice was a promise, a vow, a prayer. "Next winter, our daughter will sleep on a warm floor. I swear it, Astrid. On my life, I swear it." Solveig survived that night, and the next, and the next. The fever broke on the fourth day, leaving her weak but alive. By spring, she was running and playing again, as if the brush with death had never happened. But Gunnar did not forget his promise. He spent every spare moment that spring working on his designs. He explained the principles to Astrid night after night, teaching her about heat and mass and insulation. He showed her how a conventional fireplace was actually a cooling device, how it sucked warm air up the chimney and pulled cold air in through every crack. He showed her how a masonry heater could capture 90% of the fire's energy instead of losing it to the sky. "You must learn this," he told her. "You must understand it as well as I do." "Why?" she asked. "You will be here to build it." He was quiet for a long moment. "Because I might not be," he said finally. "Because anything can happen. Because if something happens to me, someone must finish what I started." 3 weeks later, a white pine that should have fallen north went south instead. Gunnar died with his journal in his coat pocket, the pages stained with his blood, his promise still unkept. They brought his body home on a sledge, wrapped in canvas, already stiff with cold. Astrid had washed him herself. She had sent the children to Dorothea Pembry's cabin, not wanting them to see their father like this, and she had done what needed to be done alone. She heated water on the stove. She removed his bloody clothing. She cleaned the wounds that had killed him, the massive injuries to his head and chest where the tree had struck. She sang as she worked, the old songs, the songs her grandmother had taught her, the songs that Norwegian women had sung for centuries as they prepared their dead for burial. Songs about the journey to Valhalla, songs about reunion in the afterlife, songs about love that death could not destroy. And when she was finished, she dressed him in his best clothes, the suit he had worn on their wedding day, carefully preserved through all their years of poverty and struggle. She combed his hair, she crossed his hands over his chest, and then she sat with him through the night, holding his cold hand, talking to him about the children, about the future, about all the things they would never do together. The ground was frozen too hard for burial. Gunnar's body was placed in the shed behind their cabin, preserved by the same cold that had made his dream so urgent. He would wait there until spring, when the earth would finally accept him. For 3 days, Astrid did not eat. For 3 days, she sat with his journal, reading every word he had written, studying every diagram, memorizing every calculation. The journal was stained with his blood, but the pages were still legible. His handwriting was clear. His designs were complete. He had known. Some part of him had known that he might not live to build it himself. So he had written everything down, explained everything, made sure that someone else could finish what he had started. On the 4th day, Astrid stopped crying. On the 5th day, she picked up a shovel. "That woman's digging graves for her neighbors," Thaddeus Crane announced at the general store, loud enough for everyone to hear. Crane was 55 years old, built like a barrel, with hands the size of dinner plates and a reputation that stretched from the Ohio River to the Dakota Territory. He had come west 30 years ago, when Wisconsin was still wild, and he had made his name building cabins that could withstand anything the winters threw at them. 43 cabins, he liked to say, 43 families that had survived because of structures he built with his own 2 hands. He knew what worked and what didn't in a Wisconsin winter. He knew this wouldn't work. "I've seen men try 100 foolish things to cheat the cold, Bashid," he continued, warming to his audience. "Root cellars with stovepipes, underground sleeping rooms, double walls filled with sawdust that caught fire and burned whole families alive." He shook his head slowly, his expression a mixture of pity and contempt. "But this, digging tunnels to the neighbors, lining them with stones like some kind of underground road, this is the most foolish yet." The men gathered around the pickle barrel nodded their agreement. There was Ezra Callister, who owned the general store. There was Reverend Aldous Whitmore, one whose Presbyterian sermons warned against foreign superstitions. There was Dr. Phineas Lockwood, who had studied medicine in Philadelphia and never let anyone forget it. And there was Virgil Hargrave, who owned the livery stable and sold firewood to half the families in the valley. Hargrave had particular reason to be concerned. If this foreign woman had actually found a way to heat multiple cabins with a single fire, his business would suffer. He sold 20 cords of wood every winter to the 3 families she was trying to connect to her system. That was real money. "Someone should tell her," Hargrave said, his voice thick with false concern, "before she hurts herself, before she gives those old folks false hope." "I tried," Crane said. "Went out there yesterday, explained the physics of the thing. I told her that her flue to old Zeke Holloway's place is 90 feet long. By the time any heat gets there, it'll be colder than the outside air. The smoke won't rise. It'll back up and fill her cabin with poison." He paused for effect. "Do you know what she said to me?" The men leaned in. "She said, 'The smoke is not the heat. It is just the vehicle for the heat.'" Crane snorted. "Whatever that means." Then she went right back to digging, like I hadn't said a word, like I hadn't built 43 cabins while she was still in diapers back in Norway. "The grief has taken her mind," said Prudence Coldwell from her usual position near the door, where she could see everyone who came and went. Prudence was 52, the widow of the previous minister, and she had appointed herself the unofficial keeper of Ridgewood Hollow's moral standards. "Ah, poor thing. First her husband, now her sanity. Someone really should intervene. Maybe the doc should have a look at her," suggested Boone Callister, Ezra's son, who was 23 and always eager to be part of whatever was happening. "See if she's fit to care for those children." "Now hold on," said a quiet voice from the corner. Everyone turned. Old Soren Bergstrom was 79 years old, the only other Scandinavian immigrant in Ridgewood Hollow. He had come to America 40 years ago, long before Astrid was born, and he had nearly forgotten the language of his childhood. But some memories stayed sharp, no matter how many years tried to dull them. Soren had been sitting in the corner, nursing a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold, listening to the conversation with growing irritation. Now he set down his cup and rose slowly to his feet, his old joints creaking in protest. "I saw this in Bergen when I was a boy," he said, his voice creaking like an old door. "My grandfather heated 3 houses with one fire. The floors were always warm, even when the snow was deep as a man's chest outside, even when the temperature dropped so low that spit froze before it hit the ground." The room was silent. "She is not mad," Soren continued, his eyes moving from face to face, lingering on each man who had been laughing a moment before. "She is doing what her husband taught her, what his people have done for generations, what my people did before we forgot." He picked up his cane and began shuffling toward the door. "You laugh because you do not understand," he said, "because it is easier to mock than to learn. Because your pride cannot accept that a woman might know something you do not." He paused at the door and looked back at them. "But I understand. I remember. And when the cold comes, when the real cold comes, the kind that kills, you will understand too." He opened the door, letting in a blast of October air. "You will see," he said. "You will all see." The door closed behind him. The room was quiet for a moment. Then Boone Callister laughed. "The old man's as crazy as she is. Must be something in the water over in Norway." The tension broke. Men chuckled. The conversation moved on to other topics: the price of flour, the late corn harvest, who would win the sheriff's election in the spring. But Thaddeus Crane did not laugh. He stood by the window watching old Soren shuffle down the muddy street, and something cold that had nothing to do with the weather settled in his stomach. The confrontation with the town council came on November 5th, a formal summons delivered by Deputy Sheriff Tom Gallagher, requiring Astrid Lindgren to appear before the council to answer concerns about her construction project. Gallagher was a decent man, and he looked uncomfortable as he handed her the paper. "I'm sorry about this, Mrs. Lindgren," he said. "I told them it wasn't right, hauling a widow before them like some kind of criminal." But Hargrave insisted. Astrid took the summons and read it carefully. "When?" she asked. "Tomorrow afternoon, 2 o'clock, the back room of Callister's store." She nodded. "Thank you for your kindness, Deputy." Gallagher hesitated at the edge of her property, watching her children work alongside her, Leaf hauling stones, Solveig carrying water. "For what it's worth," he said, "I hope you know what you're doing. Those folks depending on you, Mrs. Pembry, Mrs. Whitaker, old Zeke, they don't have anyone else." "I know," Astrid said. "Just be careful. These men, they don't like being told they're wrong, especially not by a woman." Astrid smiled, though there was no humor in it. "I know that too." The meeting was held in the back room of the Callister General Store, a cramped space usually used for storing excess inventory. 7 men sat in judgment around a table cluttered with ledgers and invoices: Thaddeus Crane, Dr. Phineas Lockwood, Reverend Aldous Whitmore, Virgil Hargrave, Ezra Callister, and 2 farmers named Henderson and Porter. Astrid stood before them alone, the gunner's journal clutched in her hands like a talisman. Odin had tried to follow her, but she had commanded him to stay with the children. This was not a battle that could be won with growling. "Mrs. Lindgren," began Ezra Callister, who served as unofficial chairman, "concerns have been raised about the safety of the elderly citizens you've convinced to participate in this scheme. We're here to determine whether you should be permitted to continue." "It is not a scheme," Astrid said quietly, her accent thickening under stress. "It is engineering. Call it what you will." Callister shuffled some papers importantly. "The question before this council is whether we should stop you before someone gets hurt." "Or killed," Crane added. Astrid looked at each man in turn. Crane, who had called her work foolish. Lockwood, who had called it a death trap. Whitmore, who had implied from his pulpit that it was pagan superstition. Hargrave, who saw only a threat to his firewood sales. "May I explain?" she asked. "May I show you why this will work?" Callister shrugged. "You may try." Astrid opened Gunner's journal to the pages she knew by heart. She had brought chalk and asked permission to use the small blackboard at the back of the room, the one normally used for tallying store accounts. For 20 minutes, she drew diagrams. She explained how a conventional fireplace loses 90% of its heat up the chimney, creating a draft that actually pulls cold air into the cabin through every crack and gap. She described how a masonry heater captures that lost heat in tons of brick and soapstone, releasing it slowly over 12 to 24 hours. She detailed how insulated underground channels could carry residual heat to neighboring structures, how the ash from years of cooking fires could serve as insulation comparable to the finest materials money could buy. She spoke clearly, precisely using the English that Gunnar had taught her, translating the concepts he had explained into words these men might understand. When she finished, the room was silent. Then Thaddeus Crane spoke. "It's clever on paper, Mrs. Lindgren. I'll grant you that. Your husband was clearly an educated man. But paper isn't practice. Theory isn't survival. You're asking us to let you gamble with the lives of 3 vulnerable citizens based on calculations that have never been tested here." "They were tested," Astrid said, "in Norway, in Finland, in Russia, for hundreds of years. My husband's grandfather used this system, his great-grandfather before him. The knowledge goes back generations." "This isn't Norway, Mrs. Lindgren. This is Wisconsin. The physics do not change with geography, Mr. Crane. Heat is heat. Cold is cold. The principles that work in Bergen will work in Ridgewood Hollow." Another silence. Old Soren Bergstrom, who had been sitting in the corner, uninvited but unwilling to stay away, rose slowly to his feet. "I told you before," he said, his voice carrying clearly despite its age. "I told you all before. I saw this in the old country. My grandfather heated 3 houses with 1 fire, and those houses were warm when everyone else was freezing. The woman knows what she is doing. You would do well to listen instead of lecture." The council members exchanged glances. Finally, Ada Ezra Callister sighed heavily. "We cannot legally stop you from building on your own property, Mrs. Lindgren. Nor can we prevent your neighbors from agreeing to whatever arrangements they choose. This is still America, and a person's property is their own." He leaned forward, his expression hardening. "But I must be clear. If anyone is harmed because they trusted your system instead of preparing properly for winter, you will be held responsible. Legally, morally, and in every other way this community can devise. Do you understand?" "I understand," Astrid said. "Then we are adjourned." She walked out of that meeting with her head high, though her hands were trembling inside her shawl. Behind her, she heard Virgil Hargrave mutter to Crane, "She'll kill them all, mark my words, and when she does, Soy will be there to say we warned her." Astrid did not look back. She had work to do. The next morning, she found she was no longer alone. Old Ezekiel Holloway stood at the edge of her property as the sun rose, leaning on a cane made from twisted oak, his sightless eyes turned toward the sound of her digging. Zeke was 78 years old. He had been a corporal in the Union Army, had fought at Antietam and Gettysburg, had seen things that still haunted his dreams 60 years later. The war had taken his youth and his innocence. Time had taken his sight, but it had not taken his spirit. "Mrs. Lindgren," he said, his voice rough as gravel, "I heard what happened at that council meeting yesterday. I heard what those men said about you." Astrid stopped digging and wiped her forehead with the back of her hand. "Fatka news travels fast. Not much else to do around here but talk." He shifted his weight on his cane. "I also heard that you're building something to keep me warm this winter. That true?" "It is." "Then I figure I ought to help." He lifted his cane and tapped it against the frozen ground. "I can't see well enough to fit stones. Eyes went bad about 5 years ago. The doctors say it's cataracts, whatever those are. But I can carry. Point me to the pile and tell me where to bring them." Astrid stared at him. This man was nearly 80 years old, blind. He could barely walk without his cane. "Mr. Holloway, you don't have to." "I know I don't have to," he interrupted. "I want to. You're giving me a chance to survive another winter. Let me help earn it." She was quiet for a moment. Then she nodded, though he couldn't see the gesture. "So, the pile by the oak tree," she said. "Flat stones first, about the size of a serving platter." He shuffled toward the pile, his cane tapping the frozen ground ahead of him, his free hand reaching out to feel his way. It took him 10 minutes to bring the first stone, a journey a young man could have completed in 30 seconds. But he came back for another, and another, and another. That afternoon, Nella Whitaker appeared with all 3 of her children. Nella was 31 years old, with hair the color of autumn leaves and eyes that had lost their light 8 months ago. Her husband Samuel had died in the same accident that killed Gunnar, struck by that same white pine that fell the wrong direction. But Samuel's death had been different. Gunnar had seen the tree beginning to fall. He had seen Samuel standing in its path, oblivious to the danger. And in that terrible instant, Gunnar had made a choice. He had pushed Samuel out of the way. The push had saved Samuel from instant death. It had given him 3 extra hours. 3 hours to say goodbye to his children, 3 hours to tell Nella he loved her, 3 hours to make his peace with God, 3 hours that Gunnar had given to another man's family instead of his own. Gunnar had died instantly. Samuel had lingered, his crushed legs and broken spine slowly failing, long enough to know that he was dying and why. His last words had been about Gunnar. "Tell his widow," he had whispered to Nella. "Tell her what he did. Tell her I'm sorry." Nella had delivered the message, and she and Astrid had wept together over their dead husbands. But they had not spoken much since then. The grief was too raw, and the debt was too large. Now Nella stood at the edge of Astrid's property, her 3 children clustered around her like chicks around a hen. "We can carry Ash," she said simply. "The children are small, but they're willing. And I owe you this, Mrs. Lindgren. I owe you more than I can ever repay." "You owe me nothing," Astrid said quietly. "I owe you everything." Nella's voice cracked. "Your husband pushed mine out of the path of that tree. He gave Samuel 3 extra hours to live, 3 hours to say goodbye to his children. Samuel was holding my hand when he died. He was looking into my eyes. He knew his children were there, knew they would remember his final words." She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. "That was your husband's gift to us. 3 hours instead of nothing. A goodbye instead of sudden silence." She straightened her shoulders. "Let us help. Please, let me give something back." And so Astrid's little army grew. The blind veteran who could only carry 1 stone at a time, the grieving widow and her fatherless children. Old Dorothea Pembury, 72 years old and bent nearly double with arthritis, who could not lift or carry, but who insisted on cooking meals for everyone else. They were the forgotten ones of Ridgewood Hollow. The old, the widowed, the children of widows, the ones who had no voice in town meetings, no seat at the tables where decisions were made, no say in what was possible and what was foolish. They were building something together, and they were building it with faith. I want you to pause here for just a moment and think about what Astrid told the council. The smoke is not the heat. It is just the vehicle for the heat. That single sentence contains a principle that modern engineers are only now beginning to rediscover. It's the key to everything that's about to happen. Stay with me, and I'll explain exactly what it means, and why everyone in Ridgewood Hollow was about to learn that this young widow understood something they had all forgotten. To understand why Astrid's system was brilliant instead of mad, you must first understand why every other cabin in Ridgewood Hollow was slowly killing its occupants. The American frontier fireplace was a beautiful disaster. It stood in nearly every cabin from the Atlantic to the Pacific, a symbol of home and hearth and family warmth. Poets wrote about it. Painters captured its glow on canvas. Children fell asleep to its crackling music, and it was killing people. Not through fire, though that happened too. The frontier fireplace killed through its fundamental inefficiency, a design flaw so basic that no one even recognized it as a flaw. A fireplace heats through radiation. Infrared waves travel in straight lines from the flames and hot coals, warming the first solid object they encounter. Stand with your face to the fire, and your cheeks will burn. Turn around, and your back will freeze. The heat goes nowhere except straight out, in a narrow cone that creates a small zone of scorching warmth surrounded by drafty cold. But the real problem was far worse than uneven heating. A fireplace needs oxygen to burn, lots of oxygen. A healthy fire might consume the oxygen in a room multiple times per hour. And that oxygen has to come from somewhere. It comes from inside the cabin. As the fire burns, it creates a powerful draft that sucks air up the chimney. Hot air rises, every child knows this, and the chimney provides a perfect channel for that hot air to escape. It rushes upward, carrying the heat of the fire directly into the sky, where it dissipates uselessly into the frozen Wisconsin night. And for every cubic foot of hot air that goes up, a cubic foot of cold air must be pulled in to replace it, through every crack in the walls, through every gap between the logs, through the spaces around windows that no amount of oiled paper can fully seal, through the gaps under doors that no amount of rags can completely block. The fireplace creates a constant wind, an invisible river of Arctic air flowing into the cabin to feed the hungry flames. The bigger the fire, the stronger the draft. The stronger the draft, the more cold air pours in to replace what's being sucked up the chimney. The fireplace wasn't just failing to heat the cabin, it was actively cooling it. The mathematics were brutal. A well-designed fireplace might convert 10% of the wood's energy into useful heat. The other 90% went up the chimney, along with the warm air from inside the cabin. A family could burn 20 cords of wood in a single winter, 200 cubic feet of timber that had taken years to grow, hours to cut, days to split and stack, and still never feel truly warm. They were fighting a battle against physics they didn't understand, and they were losing. Gunnar Lindgren had spent 20 years in the boiler rooms of Baltic steamships. He understood heat the way a master musician understands sound. Not just the notes, but the silences between them. Not just the flames, but the invisible forces that carried warmth from one place to another. He had spent those 20 years in the bowels of ships, tending the massive coal-fired boilers that powered them across the cold northern seas. He had learned to read temperature gauges, to calculate heat transfer rates, to understand the difference between conduction and convection and radiation. He had learned that heat was not magic, it was physics. It followed rules as precise and predictable as the movements of the stars. And he had learned three principles that the frontier carpenters of America had never been taught. First, heat is not the same as fire. Fire produces heat, but once produced, heat has its own existence. Oh no, its own rules, its own ways of moving through the world. Heat flows from hot objects to cold objects, always without exception, until equilibrium is reached. You cannot stop this flow, but you can control it. You can direct it. You can store it. Second, mass holds heat. A hot iron stays hot long after the forge goes cold. A sun-warmed stone radiates warmth into the evening air. Water retains heat far longer than air. The more mass you have, the more heat you can store, and the longer you can release it after the source goes cold. Third, insulation slows the flow. Trapped air, dead air, air that cannot move. This is the finest insulator nature provides. Better than wood, better than wool, better than anything you can buy in a general store. Still air creates a barrier that heat struggles to cross. These three principles, control, mass, our insulation, were the foundation of everything Gunnar had designed. And they were the foundation of what Astrid was building. The masonry heater was not a fireplace. It was a thermal battery. The difference was fundamental, as different as a leaky bucket is from a sealed cistern. In a conventional fireplace, you burn wood constantly, feeding the fire throughout the day and night, losing 90% of the heat up the chimney. It's like trying to fill a bathtub while the drain is wide open. You pour water in, and it pours right back out. The only water that stays is what's currently flowing from the tap. In a masonry heater, you burn a small amount of wood very hot and very fast. 2 hours in the morning, 2 hours in the evening. The intense fire burns cleanly, generating enormous heat in a concentrated burst. But that heat doesn't escape. The firebox of a masonry heater is small, much smaller than a conventional fireplace. It's designed to create intense, efficient combustion, rather than the lazy, smoky burning of a typical fire. The flames roar and dance, consuming the wood completely, leaving almost nothing behind but fine white ash. Above and around the firebox, hidden inside the bulk of the heater, is a maze. Brick channels and baffles force the hot exhaust gases to wind back and forth, traveling 23 feet through the structure before finally reaching the chimney. Each turn, each chamber, each surface the gases touch is an opportunity to surrender heat. As the gases pass through this maze, they transfer their thermal energy to the surrounding brick and soapstone, tons of it, 3,000 or 4,000 pounds of thermal mass that absorbs the energy like a sponge absorbs water. By the time the gases reach the chimney, they have given up 90% of their heat. That energy is now stored in the brick, And that brick will radiate warmth steadily, constantly, silently for the next 12 to 24 hours. No more feeding the fire every hour. No more cold nights when the flames die down. No more hot spots in front of the hearth and frozen corners everywhere else. Just gentle, even, constant warmth. The construction of such a heater was not simple labor. It was precision work, the kind that required patience and skill in equal measure. Astrid began by selecting each brick by hand. Not just any brick would do. The bricks needed to be dense, heavy, capable of absorbing and holding enormous amounts of heat without cracking or crumbling. She rejected dozens of bricks from the settlement's small brickyard, testing each one by tapping it against another, listening for the clear ring that indicated proper firing. The soapstone was harder to acquire. She had found a deposit 7 miles north of Ridgewood Hollow, near a creek bed where the water had exposed veins of the soft gray-green stone. Every Saturday for 6 weeks, she and Leif had made the journey with their small cart, loading it with as much stone as their aging horse could pull. Soapstone had properties that seemed almost magical. It absorbed heat slowly, held it tenaciously, and released it gradually over many hours. In Scandinavia, soapstone stoves were family heirlooms, passed from generation to generation, some still functioning after 200 years of continuous use. The internal structure of the heater was where Gunnar's genius truly showed. Most people looking at the finished heater would see only a large brick structure with a small door at the bottom. They would have no idea what lay inside. But inside was a labyrinth. The exhaust gases from the firebox did not simply rise up and exit through a chimney. Instead, they were forced to travel through a series of chambers and channels, winding back and forth through the structure. Each turn created turbulence, mixing the hot gases and forcing them into contact with more surface area. Astrid had memorized Gunnar's drawings until she could build the internal structure blindfolded. The channels were sized precisely. Too narrow and they would clog with ash. Too wide and the gases would not transfer enough heat. The angles of each turn were calculated to create the exact degree of turbulence needed. Leif watched his mother work with something like awe. "How do you remember where all the channels go, Mama?" he asked one evening, as she carefully mortared another brick into place. Astrid smiled, though her eyes were sad. "Your father drew it for me, night after night, until I could see it in my sleep. He knew he might not always be here to build it himself, so he made sure I could do it without him." She placed the brick and wiped her hands. "That's what love does, Leif. It prepares you for the times when you have to go on alone." But Astrid wasn't just heating her own cabin. She was heating 4. This was the part that baffled the skeptics. This was the part that Thaddeus Crane had called a death trap. And this was the part that proved Gunnar Lindgren had been a genius. When the exhaust gases left Astrid's masonry heater, they were cooler than they would have been leaving a conventional fireplace. Perhaps 300 degrees instead of 600. But 300 degrees was still hot enough to do useful work, if that heat could be captured. The underground channels were the key. Thaddeus Crane was right about one thing. If you ran an uninsulated pipe 90 feet underground, the heat would be gone before it reached the other end. The cold earth would steal it, sucking the warmth out of the gases until they were colder than the air above. But Astrid's channels were not uninsulated. They were super insulated. Those 47 barrels of ash, the accumulation of 2 years of cooking fires, surrounded each stone channel with a foot-thick layer of thermal barrier. Wood ash traps air in millions of tiny pockets, creating insulation comparable to modern fiberglass. The heat had nowhere to go but forward. It flowed along the stone channels, warming the rocks themselves, which absorbed and stored the heat just like the masonry heater above. The earth surrounding the insulated channels eventually dried out and became part of the thermal battery itself, holding warmth for days at a time. At the end of each channel in each neighbor's cabin, Astrid had built a stone platform, a low slab of mortared fieldstone about 4 feet by 6 feet, rising a few inches above the dirt floor. The underground channel flowed into this platform, warming it before exiting through a small stovepipe on the far wall. The platforms would not blast hot air into the rooms. That would have been inefficient and drafty. Instead, they would slowly heat up to 85 or 90 degrees, warm and pleasant to the touch. They would radiate gentle warmth constantly, day and night, heating the floor, the furniture, the people. Astrid was not giving her neighbors a fire. She was giving them a heated foundation. By the end of November, the system was complete. The masonry heater rose in the center of Astrid's cabin like a monument to her husband's memory, a tower of brick and soapstone nearly touching the ceiling. 3 heavily damped clay pipes diverged from its back, feeding into the stone channels that ran underground to her neighbors' homes. On the first day of December, Astrid lit the inaugural fire. She used seasoned oak, dried for 2 full years, the driest, densest wood she could find. She built the fire hot and fast, feeding it for 2 hours until the firebox roared with white-hot intensity. Then she closed the damper and let the heater do its work. The first week, nothing visible happened. The masonry heater absorbed heat. The underground channels absorbed heat. The earth surrounding the channels absorbed heat. The massive system was charging itself, soaking up thermal energy like a vast underground reservoir filling with water. Thaddeus Crane came by on the 3rd day, his expression triumphant. "See," he announced loudly, gesturing at the cool surface of the heater. "All that work for nothing. She's warming the center of the earth while her neighbors freeze." But Astrid had expected this. Gunner's journal had warned her. The system needed time to charge. Days, perhaps weeks, before the thermal mass would reach equilibrium and begin releasing more heat than it absorbed. She kept firing the heater twice a day, trusting the physics, trusting her husband's calculations, trusting the knowledge that had been passed down through generations of Norwegian builders. On the 8th day, she noticed something. The floor of her cabin was warm, not just not cold, warm, genuinely, pleasantly warm, even in the corners farthest from the heater, even in the hours before dawn. She knelt and pressed her palm against the wooden planks. Heat rose into her hand, steady and gentle, like the warmth of a living thing. That evening, old Dorothea Pembry sent her grandson running through the snow to Astrid's cabin. "Grandma says, come quick," the boy panted, his eyes wide with something between wonder and fear. "Grandma says something's happening." Astrid's heart lurched. Had something gone wrong? Was there smoke? Had the platform cracked? She ran to Dorothea's cabin, Odin bounding through the snow beside her, her breath coming in white plumes in the cold December air. She found the old woman standing in the center of her small home, tears streaming down her weathered cheeks. But she was smiling, and she was holding her hands out in front of her, hands that had been curled into claws of pain for 5 years, hands so twisted by arthritis that she could barely grip a spoon, hands that had not opened fully since before her husband died. She was flexing her fingers, opening and closing them, slowly, wonderingly, like a child discovering a new toy. "The warmth," she whispered when she saw Astrid. "It comes up through the floor. It's in my bones. It's in my joints." A sob escaped her. "For the first time in 5 years, Mrs. Lindgren. For the first time in 5 years, my hands don't hurt." Astrid knelt beside the stone platform and pressed her palm against its surface. 87 degrees. The stone was warm, not hot, never hot enough to burn, just warm, constantly, steadily, beautifully warm. She had done it. Gunnar had done it. They had done it together. She closed her eyes, and for a moment, she could feel him standing beside her, his big, gentle hands on her shoulders, his voice in her ear. "I told you, love. I told you it would work. Next winter, our daughter will sleep on a warm floor." Tears streamed down her face. "I kept your promise, Gunnar. I kept your promise." Something remarkable was happening in those 4 cabins. Something that defied everything the people of Ridgewood Hollow thought they knew about surviving winter. One fire, tended twice a day, was keeping 4 families warm. But the true test was still coming. The skeptics said to wait for the real cold. They said the little trick wouldn't last. And maybe they would have been right under ordinary circumstances. But the winter of 1892 was not going to be ordinary. What was coming to Ridgewood Hollow would make every winter they had ever survived feel like autumn. The old-timers started talking in the 2nd week of December. They spoke quietly at first, in hushed conversations at the general store, in meaningful glances exchanged over Sunday dinner. They noticed things that younger people missed. The way the geese were flying south in enormous formations, weeks earlier than usual. The thickness of the woolly bear caterpillars, their black bands wider than anyone could remember. The strange copper color of the sunset sky, Old Soren Bergstrom was the most vocal. "I've seen this before," he said to anyone who would listen, his voice carrying the weight of 7 decades of memory. The winter of 1873, the winter that killed 200 people across Dakota and Minnesota, the winter that came down from Canada like the wrath of God himself. He stood in front of the general store, leaning on his cane, his blind eyes turned toward the northwest as if he could see the danger building there. "This one will be worse," he said. "The signs are all there. The sky, the animals, the feel of the air. Something is coming, something bad." Most people dismissed him. Old men were always predicting disaster. It gave them something to feel important about, something to prove that their years of experience still mattered. But Soren kept talking. "Get your wood inside," he warned, grabbing the arm of anyone who would listen. "All of it. Not just what you need for a week. All of it. Get your animals close. Bring them into your cabins if you have to. Board up your windows. Seal every crack you can find." His voice rose. "Because what's coming will kill anything that isn't sheltered. It will kill the strong and the weak alike. It will kill the prepared and the unprepared. It will kill anyone who thinks they can fight it the way they've always fought winter." He turned his blind eyes toward the sky. "The only ones who will survive are the ones who hide from it, the ones who find a way to wait it out while it rages and destroys everything in its path." By Christmas, even the skeptics were starting to pay attention. The temperature had been dropping steadily for 2 weeks. Not the normal December cold, the kind that made your breath fog and your fingers ache. Something deeper, something more patient. The kind of cold that settled into the earth itself, freezing the ground solid to a depth of 4 feet, turning streams into roads of ice thick enough to support a loaded wagon. But it was the sky that worried people most. The color was wrong. Instead of the clean blue of a winter afternoon, the sky had taken on a sickly yellow-gray tint that no one could remember seeing before. The clouds were low and heavy, pressing down on the valley like a lid on a pot. And on the horizon to the northwest, a darker line was forming, a wall of black that grew larger each day. "That's where it's coming from," Soren said, pointing toward the darkness with his cane. "From Canada, from the Arctic, from the places where nothing lives and nothing grows." He turned to face the small crowd that had gathered around him outside the church on Christmas morning. "It's building," he said, gathering strength, waiting for the right moment. He crossed himself, an old habit from a faith he had mostly abandoned. "God help us all when it arrives." The storm hit on January 17, 1892. It came without warning. The morning dawned cold but calm. 28 degrees, light winds, a sky the color of old pewter. Men went about their chores as they always did. Women prepared breakfast. Children complained about having to go out to the woodpile. By noon, the temperature had dropped to 15 degrees. By 3 in the afternoon, it was 5 below zero, and the wind had begun. It came from the northwest, screaming out of Canada like a living thing, carrying snow that did not fall but flew horizontally. The flakes were small and hard, more ice than snow, driven by winds that gusted to 60 miles per hour. They struck exposed skin like needles, like tiny knives, drawing blood from faces and hands. The temperature plummeted, 10 below, 20 below, 30 below, and it kept falling. By midnight, the thermometer outside the Callister General Store, if anyone had been able to read it in the darkness and the driving snow, showed 43 degrees below zero. But that number was a lie. It did not account for the wind. With the wind factored in, the effective temperature was somewhere around 65 degrees below zero, cold enough to freeze exposed flesh in less than 3 minutes. Cold enough to turn a man's breath into a cascade of ice crystals before it left his mouth. Cold enough to freeze the moisture in his eyes if he tried to look into the gale. Cold enough to kill. The storm didn't last for hours. It lasted for 9 days. The storm had a name, though no one in Ridgewood Hollow knew it yet. The old-timers would call it the Blue Norther, though that term didn't capture its true horror. A Blue Norther was supposed to be fast-moving, violent but brief, a shock of cold that swept through and moved on. This storm was different. It was patient. It was thorough. It seemed to have a will of its own, and that will was malevolent. The first day was the worst in terms of shock. People woke to a normal January morning and went to bed, if they slept at all, in what felt like another world entirely. The temperature dropped 60 degrees in 18 hours. Livestock that had been healthy at noon were found frozen solid by midnight, their bodies stiff and still in barn stalls that should have protected them. The second day was when the fear set in. By then, everyone understood that this was not going to be over quickly. The wind showed no sign of weakening. The snow showed no sign of stopping. And the cold, the terrible, relentless, soul-crushing cold, seemed to be getting worse. Wood piles that should have lasted weeks were being consumed in days. Men who normally burned 3 or 4 logs between dawn and noon were burning that many every hour, who in their cabins were still barely warm enough to survive. The third day brought the first deaths. Mrs. Agnes Pearson simply stopped breathing in her sleep. She was 83 years old, had been sick before the storm, and her body simply couldn't maintain its core temperature against the cold that crept through her cabin walls. She died without pain, without even waking, slipping from sleep into death as gently as a candle flame going out. Jacob Miller's death was worse. His fire had gone out sometime in the pre-dawn hours. He woke to a cabin that had dropped to 20 degrees, found his woodpile buried under 4 feet of drift outside his door, and went out to retrieve it in clothes that were inadequate for the conditions. They found him 3 days later, frozen solid, his hand still reaching toward his woodpile. Well, he had died 15 feet from his own door. Baby Thomas Henley's death was the one that broke the community's heart. The Henleys had done everything right. They had kept their fire burning day and night. They had wrapped their infant son in every blanket they owned. They had held him between them in their bed, sharing their body heat, breathing on his tiny face to keep it warm. But it wasn't enough. The cabin was too drafty. The fire was too inefficient. The cold was too relentless. They woke to find their son still and cold, his tiny body having surrendered to the cold sometime in the night, while they slept inches away, unable to save him. Mrs. Henley's screams echoed across the snow that morning. Everyone who heard them knew what they meant. In the cabin of Thaddeus Crane, master carpenter, builder of 43 homes, well, the fireplace was roaring. It had been roaring continuously for 72 hours. The flames consumed seasoned oak at a rate that terrified Crane. 1 log every 45 minutes, an impossible pace to maintain. His woodpile, which should have lasted until March, was already half gone. And still the cold came. It crept through the walls like something alive, through the cracks between the logs that he had caulked so carefully, through the gaps around windows that he had sealed with oiled paper, through the very fabric of the structure he had built with his own expert hands. The temperature inside his cabin was 44 degrees. His wife Helena sat wrapped in every blanket they owned, her breath rising in white plumes, her lips beginning to take on a bluish tinge. Their 3 children huddled around her. Marcus, who was 12 and trying to be brave, Sarah, who was 9 and had been crying for hours, and little Elva, who was 5 years old and had stopped making noise entirely. Elva had stopped shivering an hour ago. Crane knew what that meant. Every frontier man knew what that meant. When the shivering stopped, it meant the body had given up fighting. It meant the core temperature had dropped too low for the muscles to function. It meant death was close. "Papa," she said, her voice small and distant, barely a whisper. "I'm sleepy." "Stay awake, sweetheart," Crane's voice cracked. "Stay with Papa." "But I'm so sleepy." "I know, baby, I know. But you have to stay awake. Can you do that for Papa? Can you stay awake just a little longer?" Her eyes drifted closed. "Elva? Elva!" She did not respond. Crane looked at his wife. In her eyes, he saw the same terror that was clawing at his own heart. Their daughter was dying. Their daughter was dying, and his fireplace, the fireplace he had built with 43 years of experience, could not save her. Everything he knew was wrong. Everything he had believed was failing, and his little girl was slipping away. But in 4 cabins on the eastern edge of Ridgewood Hollow, the story was different. Astrid Lindgren's cabin was warm. Not warm by comparison, not less cold than the death raging outside. Actually, genuinely, comfortably warm. The masonry heater stood silent in the center of the room, its surface cool to the touch. The fire inside had died to ash hours ago, but the tons of brick and soapstone surrounding that firebox radiated heat steadily, constantly, silently. filling every corner of the cabin with gentle warmth. The temperature inside was 68 degrees. Leif and Solveig sat on the floor, playing with the carved wooden animals their father had made before he died. They wore no coats. They needed no blankets. The wooden planks beneath them were warm to the touch. Odin lay stretched near the door, his silver coat rising and falling with the easy breathing of a dog who had no reason to be afraid. Astrid sat at her table, reading Gunnar's journal by lamplight, her face soft in the golden glow. Outside, death howled and screamed and tried to claw its way inside. Inside, there was peace. In the cabin of Dorothea Pembry, the 72-year-old widow was doing something she had not done in 5 years. She was knitting. Her fingers, loosened by weeks of gentle warmth radiating up from the stone platform, Honey moved with an ease she had forgotten was possible. The needles clicked softly as she worked, creating a pattern her mother had taught her 60 years ago in a small village in Massachusetts. The temperature in her cabin was 64 degrees. She had not lit a fire in her fireplace since November. She had not needed to. In the cabin of Ezekiel Holloway, the 78-year-old blind veteran was smoking his pipe. He sat in his chair near the warm stone platform, his sightless eyes closed, a small smile on his weathered face. The tobacco was from his dwindling supply, a luxury he had been rationing for months. But tonight, with the storm raging outside and the warmth rising up through the floor, he had decided to indulge. He had fought at Antietam and Gettysburg. He had watched friends die in ways that still haunted his nightmares. He had buried 2 wives and seen 3 children grow to adulthood. He had expected to end his days alone in this cabin, freezing to death in some future winter when he could no longer tend a fire. But now, sitting in the gentle warmth that rose from the stones, he was beginning to think he might die in bed instead. Peacefully, comfortably, on his own terms. "You can't have me," he said aloud to the storm, to the cold, to death itself. "Not today. Not yet." He drew on his pipe and smiled. "Not yet." In the cabin of Nella Whitaker, the 3 children were asleep, not huddled together in a pile for warmth, the way they had slept every winter night since their father died. They were in their own beds, under single quilts, their faces peaceful, their breathing easy. Nella sat by the window mending a shirt by lamplight, watching the white void beyond the glass. The storm had been raging for 4 days. The temperature outside was 43 degrees below zero. The wind was screaming at 60 miles per hour, and she had not burned a single piece of firewood. She thought about her husband, Samuel. She thought about how he had died, pushed out of the way by Gunnar Lindgren, given 3 extra hours to live because another man valued his life above his own. And she thought about Astrid, the widow who had taken that gift of 3 hours and transformed it into something that would keep Nella's children alive through the worst storm anyone had ever seen. "Thank you," she whispered into the darkness, not sure if she was speaking to Samuel or to Gunnar or to Astrid or to God himself. "Thank you." Imagine what it must have been like. Outside, a killing cold beyond anything most people had ever experienced. Inside those 4 cabins, warmth and peace and safety. 23 people comfortable through a storm that was claiming lives all across the valley. The skeptics had said it couldn't be done. The experts had called it a death trap. But while Thaddeus Crane watched his daughter turn blue, while Dr. Lockwood listened to his wife's lungs fill with fluid, 4 cabins on the eastern edge of town proved that knowledge passed down through generations could save lives when all the modern wisdom failed. On the 5th night of the storm, Thaddeus Crane made a decision. His daughter Elva had stopped responding to her name. Her breathing had become shallow, irregular, with long pauses that stopped his heart each time they occurred. Her skin was cold to the touch, even under the pile of blankets. Her lips were blue. She was dying, and there was only one place in Ridgewood Hollow that might save her. "Helena," he said, his voice cracking, "dress the children, all of them, everything warm we own. We're going to Mrs. Lindgren's cabin." His wife stared at him. "Thaddeus, the storm—" "I know. It's 100 yards. In this wind, in this cold." "I know." His voice broke. "But Elva won't survive another night here. She might not survive the walk, but she definitely won't survive staying." He began pulling on every piece of warm clothing he owned, layering coats and scarves and gloves until he could barely move his arms. "I was wrong, Helena. I was wrong about everything. That woman knew something I didn't, and I called her foolish in front of the whole town. I said she was building a death trap. I said she was mad with grief. He picked up his daughter, her small body limp and cold in his arms. And now our daughter is paying for my pride, my arrogance, my absolute certainty that I knew better than some foreign widow with strange ideas. He looked at his wife with eyes that held no trace of the confident master carpenter who had dominated town meetings for 20 years. If Elva dies because I was too proud to ask for help, I will never forgive myself. Never. The walk was 93 steps. Crane had counted them once, on a calm summer day, measuring the distance between his cabin and the Lindgren property for no particular reason. 93 steps, less than a minute's walk on a normal day. Tonight, it nearly killed them. The wind was a physical force, a wall of frozen air that pushed back against every step. It was like walking into a river of ice, a current that wanted to sweep them away, to knock them down, to bury them in snow where they would never be found. The snow was waist-deep in places, with drifts that reached to Crane's chest. He couldn't see his feet. He couldn't see the ground. He could barely see Helena, struggling along 2 steps behind him, with their other 2 children clutched under her arms. The cold was beyond anything he had ever experienced. It burned his lungs with every breath. It froze the moisture in his nostrils. It turned his exposed skin to numb wood within seconds. He could not see the cabin. He could not see anything except white. An endless, swirling, screaming white that obliterated the world. He navigated by memory and desperation, counting steps, praying he was going in the right direction. 87, 88, 89, 90. Where was it? Had he gotten turned around? Was he walking the wrong direction, leading his family into the white void where they would all freeze to death? 91. His foot hit something solid, a wall. Thank God, a wall. He felt along it with his frozen hands, searching desperately for a door. His fingers were so numb he could barely tell what they were touching. Log. Log. More log. Where was the door? He moved left, still feeling. Nothing. His hands were going numb. His face was going numb. Elva wasn't moving in his arms. Then the door opened. Light poured out, golden flickering light from oil lamps and candles. Heat poured out, gentle, enveloping heat that hit his frozen face like a blessing. And in the doorway stood Astrid Lindgren, her pale blue eyes taking in the frozen family on her threshold without surprise, without judgment, without a single moment of hesitation. "Come inside," she said. The warmth hit Crane like a physical blow. It was nothing like the blast of a fireplace, where heat scorched your face while your back stayed cold. This was something different. Something he had never experienced in any structure he had ever built. The warmth surrounded him, enveloped him, soaked into his frozen body from every direction at once. He stumbled through the door, still holding Elva, unable to process what he was feeling. The floor was warm, the walls were warm, the very air was warm, still and gentle, without the drafts and currents that plagued every cabin he had ever known. "The platform," Astrid said, already moving across the room. "Lay her by the platform. The warmth will help." Crane stumbled to where she pointed, a spot near the corner where quilts had been arranged on the floor next to a low stone slab. He laid his daughter down as gently as his frozen hands would allow, his movements clumsy and desperate. The stones beneath the quilts radiated heat, gentle, constant, penetrating warmth that he could feel through the fabric, through Elva's blankets, seeping into her small, cold body. For a long moment, nothing happened. Elva lay still, too still. Crane held his breath. Behind him, Helena was crying, her frozen tears making tracks down her cheeks. Marcus and Sarah huddled together, watching their little sister with terrified eyes. Then Elva coughed, a small sound, weak, but alive. Color began to return to her cheeks, faint at first, then stronger. Her breathing steadied. Her body, as no longer fighting the cold, began to relax. "She's warming," Astrid said, kneeling beside them. Her voice was calm, steady, without any trace of the triumph she had every right to feel. "Her body is fighting again. The heat from the stones will help her blood circulate. She will need broth when she wakes and rest." Much rest. She looked at Crane. But she will wake, Mr. Crane. Your daughter will live. Crane stared at her. The woman he had mocked. The woman he had called foolish in front of everyone at the general store. The woman whose project he had tried to stop, whose intelligence he had questioned, whose knowledge he had dismissed as foreign superstition. The woman who had just saved his daughter's life. How? He whispered. The smoke, the cold ground, the 90-foot distance. It defies everything I understand, and everything I've ever learned. Astrid met his gaze. In her eyes there was no triumph, no satisfaction, no vindication, just calm certainty and something that looked like compassion. I am not sending them smoke, Mr. Crane, she said quietly. I am sending them the heat that the smoke carries. The fire heats the brick holds the heat. The ash holds the heat in the tunnel. The tunnel carries the heat to their stone floors. The stone holds the heat for them. She paused, letting the words settle. It is a slow river of warmth, not a quick fire. Very simple, really. Crane sat down heavily on a nearby bench. The strength seemed to drain out of him all at once. Simple, he said. It's the opposite of simple. It's brilliant. It's the most brilliant thing I've ever seen. He looked up at her. Emran, and his eyes were wet with tears he was not ashamed to show. I called you foolish, in front of everyone. I said you were building graves for your neighbors. I laughed at you. I encouraged others to laugh at you. You did. I was wrong. His voice cracked. God help me, Mrs. Lindgren. I was so terribly, completely wrong. He wiped his eyes with hands that were still thawing, still burning with the pain of returning circulation. Can you ever forgive me? Astrid was quiet for a moment. She looked at him. This proud man brought low by his pride, this expert humbled by his expertise, this father who had risked everything to save his child. There is nothing to forgive, Mr. Crane, she said finally. You believed what your experience taught you. Your experience was limited, that's all. And now you know something different. She glanced toward the door, where shapes were already beginning to appear through the swirling snow. More people, more families, coming to seek shelter from the storm. But there will be others coming, she said. Others whose pride is weaker than their fear. Others whose children are cold. I cannot turn them away. After what they said about you. After what we all said? Astrid smiled, and for the first time, Crane saw her husband in that smile. Saw the man who had taught her everything she knew, who had believed in things that sensible people dismissed as impossible. My husband taught me something before he died, she said. He said that warmth does not judge who deserves it. A fire does not ask if you are worthy before it warms you. She moved toward the door to welcome the next desperate family emerging from the storm. Neither will I. They came through the night, one by one, family by family. The people who had mocked Astrid Lindgren came to her door with frost on their faces and desperation in their hearts. Dr. Phineas Lockwood appeared just before midnight, carrying his wife Miriam in his arms because her lungs had grown too weak for her to walk. His scientific pride, his absolute certainty that he understood thermodynamics better than some foreign widow, had shattered completely. He said nothing as he crossed the threshold. He simply laid his wife near the warm stones and wept. Prudence Coldwell came next. The woman who had spread the cruelest gossip, who had suggested that Astrid's grief had stolen her sanity. She carried her elderly mother on her back, and she did not meet Astrid's eyes as she entered. Boone and Billy Callister arrived together, the young men who had wagered on Astrid's failure, who had made jokes at her expense in the general store. They were supporting their father Ezra between them, the general store owner who had presided over her council hearing, who had warned her that she would be held responsible for any deaths. Now he was the one seeking shelter. And more came. A widow whose cabin roof had collapsed under the weight of snow. A young couple whose fire had gone out while they slept. An old man who had run out of wood 3 days ago and had been slowly freezing ever since. Astrid turned no one away. She directed them to the 4 cabins, to her own, to Dorothea's, to Nella's, to Zeke's, spreading the refugees across all 4 warm spaces. She organized food and blankets and sleeping arrangements. She explained her system again and again to people who still could not quite believe what they were experiencing. By the end of the 7th day, 23 people were sheltered in the 4 cabins heated by Astrid's single fire. 23 people who had mocked her, 23 people who had dismissed her, 23 people who had called her mad, now huddled together in warmth that defied everything they thought they knew about winter, about fire, about what was possible. 1 fire, 4 cabins, 23 lives. The scene inside those cabins was unlike anything Ridgewood Hollow had ever witnessed. Down in Astrid's cabin, the largest of the 4, 14 people had gathered by the 7th day. They sat on every available surface, wrapped in quilts, speaking in hushed voices as if loud sounds might somehow break the spell that was keeping them warm. The children were the first to adapt. While their parents sat in the stunned silence, still struggling to comprehend how this small cabin could be warmer than their own roaring fireplaces, the children began to play. They sat on the wooden floor, the warm wooden floor, and played with Leaf's carved animals, with Solvay's rag dolls, with games invented on the spot to pass the time. Little Elva Crane, recovered from her brush with death, became particularly attached to Odin. The old dog, patient as always, allowed her to pet him for hours at a time. Boy, he seemed to understand that this small human had come close to dying, and that his warmth and comfort were part of what was healing her. "The dog is warm too," Elva announced to anyone who would listen. "Everything in this house is warm." On the 8th night, Virgil Hargrave came to the door. Astrid opened it to find the merchant standing in the snow. His wife, Constance, supported against his side. Constance's face was gray. Her ears, her nose, the tips of her fingers. They had turned white and waxy, the blood frozen in the tiny vessels, the tissue beginning to die. Frostbite. Without treatment, without sustained warmth, she would lose them all. "Please," Virgil said. His voice was barely audible above the wind. This was the man who had spoken against her at every turn. The man who had told everyone her foreign nonsense would kill people. The man who had tried to convince the council to stop her work, who had feared her success because it threatened his firewood business. "Please," and he said again, "I know what I said. I know what I did. But my wife, she never." He couldn't finish. Tears were freezing on his cheeks. Astrid looked at him for a long moment. She thought of all the obstacles he had placed in her path, all the whispered campaigns against her, all the customers he had tried to frighten away from her system with warnings of death and disaster. And then she thought of Gunnar. She thought of what he had taught her. She thought of what he would have done. "Bring her inside," Astrid said. The storm broke on the morning of the 9th day. The wind died first, tapering from a scream to a moan, to a whisper, to nothing. Then the snow stopped. The last flakes drifting down in lazy spirals, settling on a landscape transformed into something alien and white. Then for the first time in 9 days, the sun rose on a clear sky. The survivors emerged from their shelters to assess the damage. Ridgewood Hollow looked like a battlefield. Barn roofs had collapsed under the weight of snow. Fences had vanished beneath drifts. Livestock had frozen in their stalls. Cattle, horses, chickens, pigs, all dead, their bodies preserved by the cold that had killed them. 7 people had died: Mrs. Agnes Pearson, Jacob Miller, baby Thomas Henley, and 4 others whose cabins had failed them, whose fires had gone out, whose bodies had surrendered to the cold while the storm raged outside. 7 graves would need to be dug when the ground thawed, but it could have been so many more. Or 23 lives saved by 1 fire and the knowledge of a woman everyone called crazy. What would have happened if Astrid had given up when they laughed? What if she had believed them when they called her foolish? What if she had turned Thaddeus Crane away when he came to her door with his dying daughter? Sometimes knowledge is dismissed because it comes from unfamiliar places. Sometimes the people who know the most important things are the ones the world is too busy to hear. Stay with me for the final part of this story, because what happened next would change Ridgewood Hollow forever. The gathering at the general store happened 3 days after the storm ended. The building had survived intact, though snow had drifted against its walls to a depth of 6 feet. Men had spent the morning shoveling paths through the white desert that Ridgewood Hollow had become, creating corridors between the surviving structures. Now they gathered in the store's back room. the same room where Astrid had faced the council just months before. But everything was different now. Men with frost-bitten faces and hollow eyes, women with children who had stopped trusting that the world was safe, everyone with a story about how close they had come, how narrow their escape, how much they had lost, and everyone with questions about the 4 cabins on the eastern edge of town. Dr. Phineas Lockwood spoke first, his voice rough with shame. "I was there," he said, his eyes fixed on the floor. The temperature inside was nearly 70 degrees. The fire had been out for hours, the heater's surface was barely warm to the touch. But the room was warm. The floor was warm. Everything was warm. He shook his head slowly. "I calculated the thermodynamics of her system and pronounced it impossible. I called it a death trap. I told everyone who would listen that she was going to kill the very people she was trying to help." He looked up and his eyes were wet. "I was wrong. I was completely, utterly wrong. And if I had listened instead of lectured, my wife might not be recovering from pneumonia right now." The room was silent. Then Thaddeus Crane rose to his feet, the master carpenter, the builder of 43 cabins, the most respected practical man in the county. He stood in the center of the room with his hat in his hands, looking like a man who had lost a war he hadn't known he was fighting. "I called her work foolish," he said, his voice steady but heavy with emotion. "I stood in this very room and said she was building graves for her neighbors. I laughed at her. We all laughed." He paused, gathering himself. "My daughter Elva almost died because of that laughter. She was 5 years old and she was turning blue in my arms, and my fireplace, the fireplace I built with my own expert hands, couldn't save her. 43 cabins I've built, and I didn't know enough to keep a 5-year-old child warm." His voice cracked. Mrs. Lindgren opened her door without hesitation. She never mentioned what I had said about her. She never asked for an apology. She never said "I told you so." She just let us in and gave us warmth and saved my daughter's life. He looked around the room at the faces of his neighbors, faces he had known for years, faces that had laughed with him at the Foreign Widows Crazy Project. "I don't understand how her system works. Not fully. I don't understand the science. But I understand this. The mockery lasted 6 weeks. The warmth she created saved 23 lives in 9 days." He drew a deep breath. "And I will spend whatever years I have left learning everything that woman can teach me, because she knows something we forgot, something we should never have forgotten, and it almost killed us all when we needed it most." From the corner, old Soren Bergstrom rose slowly to his feet, leaning heavily on his cane. "I told you," he said, his voice creaking with age and vindication. "I told you I saw this in the old country. I told you my grandfather heated 3 houses with 1 fire. I told you she knew what she was doing." He looked at the assembled crowd, the men who had dismissed him as a crazy old man, the women who had pitied Astrid as a grief-stricken fool. "This is how real knowledge survives," he said. "Not through colleges, not through books written by men who have never touched the things they write about, through grandmothers who remember, through grandfathers who teach, through the patient passing of wisdom from one generation to the next." He sat back down, his ancient joints creaking in protest. "Maybe now you'll listen." The spring of 1892 brought thaw and transformation. As the snow melted and the ground softened, the people of Ridgewood Hollow began to rebuild. Barns were raised, fences were mended. The 7 who had died were buried in the cemetery on the hill, their graves marked with simple wooden cross that would eventually be replaced with proper stones. But something else was being built that spring. Something that would outlast the barns and the fences and even the gravestones. Thaddeus Crane arrived at Astrid's cabin on the first warm day of March, carrying his toolbox and his humility. "I can't read your husband's journal," he said, standing in her doorway with his hat in his hands. "The calculations are beyond me, but I can build. If you explain the principles, I can build whatever you tell me to build." Astrid looked at him for a long moment. Then she smiled. "Come inside, Mr. Crane. We have much work to do." By the winter of 1895, 40 cabins in Ridgewood Hollow had adopted the Lindgren system. The transformation had happened gradually at first, and then faster as success bred success. Crane learned how to construct masonry heaters from Astrid's careful instruction. He learned the sizing of the internal channels, the placement of the baffles, the importance of proper materials. He learned about thermal mass and heat storage and insulation, and he taught others. His apprentices learned from him, and they taught their apprentices in turn. The knowledge spread like ripples from a stone dropped in still water, reaching further and further with each passing season. By 1900, the number of retrofitted cabins had grown to 67. Mercy Ashworth, the young schoolteacher who had believed in Astrid from the beginning, documented everything with scientific precision. She recorded temperatures, tracked firewood consumption, noted health outcomes. Her meticulous data would eventually be submitted to the county recorder. The results were remarkable. Firewood consumption had dropped by 58% among families using the system. Winter mortality among the elderly, which had averaged 2 or 3 deaths per year in Ridgewood Hollow, had fallen to 0. Respiratory illnesses, which had been common in the smoky, drafty conventional cabins, had decreased by more than half. The years passed, as years do, carrying away the old and bringing in the new. Old Soren Bergstrom died peacefully in the spring of 1898 in a cabin his grandson had retrofitted with a masonry heater. His last words were spoken in Norwegian, a blessing on the woman who had reminded him of home. Dorothea Pembrey lived until 1901, her arthritic hands loosened by years of gentle warmth. She made 37 baby blankets in her final years, one for every child born in Ridgewood Hollow during that time. Ezekiel Holloway died in his sleep in 1903 at the age of 89. They found him in his chair by the warm stone platform, a smile on his face, his pipe still clutched in his hand. The veteran who had expected to freeze to death alone had instead died in comfort, surrounded by heat that flowed silently from a fire built by others. Nella Whitaker remarried in 1899 to a farmer from the next valley who had come to learn the Lindgren system. Her 3 children grew up strong and healthy, and each of them eventually built homes using the principles their mother had helped pioneer. Thaddeus Crane died in 1911 at the age of 75. By then, he had built or supervised the construction of over 200 masonry heaters. He had trained 14 apprentices who went on to train apprentices of their own. His headstone bore a simple epitaph: he learned to listen. Odin died in the summer of 1906. He was nearly 19 years old, ancient for a dog, and he had spent his final years moving slowly between sunny spots in Astrid's cabin, always positioning himself where he could see the door. Astrid found him one morning, lying in a patch of sunlight that streamed through the window. His eyes were closed. His breathing had stopped. He looked peaceful, as if he had simply decided it was time to rest. She sat with him for a long time, her hand on his silver fur, remembering. She remembered the tiny puppy Gunnar had chosen because no one else wanted him. She remembered the faithful companion who had watched over her family through the darkest days. She remembered the amber eyes that had guarded her children, that had warned away skeptics and critics, that had witnessed everything she had built. She buried him beside the cabin, near the place where the first trench had been dug, where the work had begun. She marked the grave with a flat stone from the same field that had provided stones for the underground channels. She did not carve any words on the stone. She didn't need to. Everyone who saw it knew whose faithful heart lay beneath. Leif Lindgren grew up to become an engineer. He studied at the university in Madison, learning the formal mathematics and physics that his father had understood through intuition and experience. And he learned the scientific names for what his parents had built: radiant heating, thermal mass, district heating systems. He learned about the Roman hypocausts that had used similar principles 2,000 years before, and about the masonry heaters that had evolved over centuries in Scandinavia and Russia. He learned that his parents had not invented anything. They had remembered something that the world had forgotten. In 1912, at the age of 31, Leif began teaching at a technical college in Madison. His courses on heating system design drew students from across the Midwest. Young men who wanted to learn how to keep people warm without burning through forests of firewood. On his desk sat Gunnar's journal, the leather worn smooth by decades of handling. The bloodstains faded to rust-brown shadows. And the pages were now separated and mounted between protective sheets of glass, preserved for future generations. "My father designed this system," Leif would tell his students on the first day of each term. "My mother built it, and now I'm giving it to you so you can carry it forward." In 1978, researchers from the University of Wisconsin rediscovered the remains of Astrid's original system while surveying historic structures in the region. They found the underground channels still intact, the stone linings unmoved after nearly 90 years. They measured the thermal properties of the ash insulation and found it comparable to modern fiberglass. They documented the masonry heater design and recognized it as a sophisticated application of principles that Scandinavian builders had perfected over centuries. Their report, published in the Journal of Building Physics, concluded, "The Lindgren system represents a remarkable example of vernacular engineering, practical solutions developed through generations of trial and error, achieving efficiencies that modern technology is only beginning to match. The underground heat distribution network anticipates district heating by nearly a century. The masonry heater design achieves thermal storage capabilities that exceed most contemporary wood-burning appliances." The report made no mention of how the system had been received when it was first built. It made no mention of the laughter, the mockery, the council meeting where 7 men sat in judgment of a widow with a journal full of foreign calculations. It simply noted that the system worked, that it had always worked, that sometimes the most advanced solutions come not from laboratories or universities, but from grandparents who remember and grandchildren who listen. Astrid Lindgren died on a February morning in 1924. She was 65 years old. She had been sick for several months, a weakness in her lungs that no amount of warmth could heal. She had arranged her affairs, said her goodbyes, written letters to her children and grandchildren that would be opened after her passing. On the last morning, she asked to be moved to a chair by the window. She sat there wrapped in quilts, watching the snow fall softly on the valley she had called home for 33 years. The masonry heater radiated gentle warmth beside her, just as it had for 3 decades. The stone platforms in the neighboring cabins still drew heat from her fire, though new families lived there now. Families who had never known the widow who built the system that kept them warm. The cabin was exactly as it had been when she and Gunnar had first built it. The same walls, the same windows, the same view of the valley where their children had grown, where their neighbors had become family, where a promise made on a bitter February night had been kept against all odds. Her daughter Solveig sat beside her, holding her hand. "Do you remember," Astrid said, her voice weak but clear, "the night of the storm? When Mr. Crane came to the door with little Elva in his arms?" "I remember, Mama. He asked me why I would help him after everything he said." Astrid smiled, and for a moment she looked young again, young and fierce and certain. "I told him what your father told me. Home warmth does not judge who deserves it." She was quiet for a moment, watching the snow fall. "That's what we gave them, Solveig. Not just the system, not just the technique. The idea that warmth is something you share, that survival isn't about competing with your neighbors. It's about building something together that protects everyone." "Mama, let me finish, child." Astrid squeezed her daughter's hand. "Your father dreamed of keeping his family warm. One family, our family. But look what happened. Look how far it spread. Dozens of families, hundreds, all kept warm by an idea that started with one man's promise to his daughter." She looked out at the snow, and her eyes glistened with tears she was too weak to wipe away. "He would be proud, I think, of what we built, of what you and Leif became, of the grandchildren he never met, and of the great-grandchildren who will grow up warm because of what he taught me." Her voice faded to a whisper. "Tell Leif his father's work continues. Tell him to keep teaching. Tell him—" She closed her eyes. "Tell him the warmth lives on." And then she was gone. More than 200 people came to Astrid Lindgren's funeral. They came from Ridgewood Hollow and the surrounding farms. They came from neighboring counties, from towns where the Lindgren system had become standard. They came from Madison, where Leif taught, and from Milwaukee, where her grandchildren lived. Some of them were old enough to remember the Great Storm of 1892. They had been children then, huddled in warm cabins while death howled outside, saved by a widow's determination and a dead man's dream. Others were younger, born after the storm, on inheritors of warmth they had never had to earn. They knew Astrid only as the old woman in the cabin on the eastern edge of town, the one with the strange heating system that everyone copied, the one who never charged for her knowledge and never turned anyone away. They buried her next to Gunnar, on a hill overlooking the valley. Near her grave, they also marked a smaller stone for Odin, acknowledging what everyone knew, that the faithful dog had been as much a part of the story as anyone. Leif spoke at the service. "My father designed this system," he said. "My mother built it. Together, they saved 23 lives in a single storm and countless more in the decades that followed." He held up his father's journal, the leather worn smooth, the pages preserved behind glass. This is their legacy, not just the system, not just the buildings, but the idea that knowledge is meant to be shared, that warmth is not a commodity to be hoarded, but a gift to be given. He read the final entry from his father's journal, dated 3 weeks before the accident that killed him. "I have completed the designs. The system will work, I am certain of it. Astrid understands the principles well enough to build it herself if anything should happen to me. She is stronger than she knows. She will finish what I started, and our daughter will sleep on a warm floor as I promised." Leif closed the journal. "He kept his promise," he said. "They both did, and now it's our turn to keep it for them." What Astrid Lindgren built in 1891 was a rudimentary district heating system, a concept that is now a hallmark of modern energy-efficient cities across Scandinavia and Northern Europe. Her underground channels were a rustic version of the Roman hypocaust, a heating technology that had been lost to Western civilization for over 1,000 years. Her masonry heater was perfected over generations in Norway, Finland, and Russia, passed down from parent to child like a precious inheritance. Modern engineers call these principles thermal mass heating and radiant floor systems. They are the cornerstones of passive house design, the cutting edge of sustainable architecture. Buildings using these principles can maintain comfortable temperatures while using 70% less energy than conventional structures. Astrid Lindgren didn't know any of these terms. She just called it her husband's last gift. The mockery lasted 6 weeks. The warmth she created lasted for generations. Or that's how real progress spreads, not through loud pronouncements or academic papers, but through the quiet, irrefutable evidence of children sleeping soundly on warm floors while a blizzard rages outside. A conventional fireplace is a solitary, selfish thing. It demands constant tribute from one family, consuming resources without sharing the benefits. Astrid's solution was communal by its very design. Its efficiency was so great that one fire could serve 4 families. She saw her neighbors' problems not as their private struggles, but as an extension of her own, a single shared challenge to be solved with a single shared system. That vision, that warmth is something we share, not something we hoard. Maybe her greatest legacy of all. Thank you for joining me on this journey into the past. If you found this story of ingenuity as inspiring as I do, please take a moment to subscribe to this channel. And I'm curious, what knowledge has been passed down in your family? What wisdom did your grandparents share that the world has forgotten? Let me know in the comments below. I read every single one. Until next time, stay warm, stay curious, and remember, sometimes the people who know the most important things are the ones the world is too busy to hear. This video presents a historically inspired narrative for educational and storytelling purposes. The characters, names, and specific events depicted are fictional, but the building techniques and scientific principles are based on real historical practices. Masonry heaters have been used in Scandinavia and Northern Europe for centuries. Roman hypocaust heating systems date back over 2,000 years. The principles of thermal mass heating and radiant floor systems are well established in modern building science. The application of any building techniques should be done in accordance with modern building codes, safety standards, and regulations. This content does not constitute professional engineering, architectural, or legal advice.